I read this passage from Luke as I thought about today's liturgy. It added to other themes that I felt were important for this Sunday. We are, of course, at the end of the calendar year for 2017 and the beginning of a new year. How will we observe or note 2017? How will we put it to rest? As we turn our faces to the new year, what will we keep in mind? What messages will we attend to so our hearts are filled with love? We have moved through the seasons of Advent and Christmas, noticing the themes, hearing the stories, lighting the candles, opening the windows. Are those words and actions of use to us as the calendar and church seasons roll on? How's our understanding of the big picture in all the little bits of decoration and angels and guiding stars and babies? And we've reminded ourselves of the characters who the Bible stories record as witnesses, inviting us to consider God's desires and purposes for God's world. And here we are, at Christmas 1. Jesus, an 8-day-old baby, is to be presented at the temple because he is the firstborn son, and a sacrifice is to be made, as was the custom. There were 3 phrases or ideas I noticed as I was reading this passage from Luke. And the first one is about recognition. Simeon and Anna both recognized Jesus as the child they had been waiting for. And this story reminds me that in the narrative about Jesus' birth, the shepherds are the first to recognize that baby Jesus. They come at the angel's call to recognize this child of love, this miracle, the promise. And the wise men also follow that star to find what the heavens had foretold. They recognized this special birth, and they took another way after seeing the baby. And now it's Anna and Simeon's turn, 2 elderly members of the Jewish community who are drawn to this little family at the temple. Simeon has waited for decades for this child, and when he sees Jesus and holds him, he recognizes God's promise for the salvation of the world. Anna, too, she speaks about this child who were looking for the redemption of Jerusalem. Pillars of the Jewish faith, prophets from the temple, recognized and announced this baby as God's promise not only to the Jews, but to the world. And that's the second idea or phrase that I noticed in reading the passage. Simeon says, "Mine eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared for all peoples." This child is God's promise to the world. And the third phrase that stood out for me is the phrase falling and rising. This child is destined for the falling and rising of many. This is a reversal of the phrase we have heard in the media and book titles, the rise and fall of someone or some regime. And as I read the commentary in Feasting on the Word, I was interested in the ideas that the theologians put forward about falling and rising. Some of the images we are familiar with. A seed falls to the earth and dies to bring forth and bear new fruit. The old rose wilts away as the new bud emerges, falling and rising. The commentators also say that this child provokes a crisis, a decision for Anna and Simeon, a decision for all people of every generation. How we respond to this child, this one person, decides everything. The old ideas fall away, and the new will rise. Simeon says to Mary, in the life of this baby as he grows into adulthood, the world will be turned upside down. I am left with a couple of questions. As I live my life, when is it that I have recognised something profoundly important that has been life-giving, or a light shone on a situation that has helped me understand or made meaning for me? And have there been times in my life when the old has had to fall away so new understandings can emerge?
So in response, the Gospel reading for today brings to mind an encounter in which I recognised something, a way of seeing God that was new to me. At the time, I was in my 20s. It was at a time when I had become part of a tradition which understood the gospel as being something that would be taught or shown to people. However, I was relieved and happy to witness something more. At the time, I was newly in a relationship with my partner Bernard. Bernard at the time was living in an unusual household with a nun and 6 middle-aged women who'd moved out of an institution for people with disabilities, intellectual disabilities. Bernard invited me to come to this large shared household where he lived. The members of the household hosted a weekly mass followed by dinner. They welcomed a gathering of local people, many of whom lived in the nearby boarding houses and worked in nearby sheltered workshop. I later learned that Father Peter, who conducted the weekly mass in this home, had himself moved into the boarding house just a few doors up. He just moved in like any other resident. When I came to the house for the first time on a Wednesday evening, it was Anna who greeted me. Coincidentally, Anna's the name that features in the Gospel reading. Anna met me at the door and had no speech as such, but she was able to make me feel welcome. Also, I found that it was not uncommon for Anna to share her prayers, in which she vocalised, without words, an incredible depth of feeling. Anna also sometimes had the role of serving the bread or the wine. Father Peter would share the Gospel reading for the day, then expand on the meaning of that Gospel by inviting those in the room to share some of their day-to-day experiences. In the light of the Gospel reading and in the process of allowing people to share their stories, the Gospel was revealed. The Gospel was found to be the story of what God is doing in us. In my life since then, including my experience as a member of the Pitt Street community, this revelation continues to enrich and guide my life. Today's reading also leads me to recall how some years later I was privileged to experience the birth of a child, and 2 years later another. The experience for the first time was a revelation to me. As the Christ child, Jesus was for Simeon and Anna, our child was also a sign of fulfilment and peace for members of our older generations and, of course, to us. So much love for one small person, a concern for her and a trust in a future which would allow her to flourish. It was love at a personal level, but it seemed to be part of something greater. It seemed to change the world for us. The world appeared differently. Right at the start, our child needed help from the medical profession. We drove from Armidale, where we were then living, to Sydney to see specialists and then to take her to the Children's Hospital for a series of operations during her first year. At the Children's Hospital, we met other parents with their children in all sorts of circumstances, and we sensed the love of so many parents, all hopeful about a future for their children. I thought about a world of parents just like us, each vulnerable with concern for their children, each holding so much love. For many, it was as if their souls would be pierced, as Simeon had foretold to Mary. We also experienced the Children's Hospital itself, a community of people invested in the well-being of so many children and families. Working together, expressing this great accumulated love for all of our children. I've also been privileged to witness this collective love in action in school communities, both from the perspective of a parent and later as someone who works in schools. At their best, schools are a safe place for children and a great hub of community around them. I've also seen this love in action here in our community in Pitt Street, where our children benefited as they grew, from connecting with people who valued them, respectfully listened to them, and continue to this day to hold a love for them and an interest in their lives. Thirdly, I want to reflect upon how often those who care for children are themselves living in distress and how that works. I'm sure that over the years we've all known families in challenging circumstances. Working in social work, I've met parents who have come to Australia as refugees. Some of their children had been born during a time of war or in its aftermath. I cannot imagine giving birth and caring for children under such distressing circumstances. And I've been touched by the hope expressed when I hear how these parents gave their children names such as Joy or Blessing. Through work or personally, I've met parents who have experienced the death of a partner or another family member, or been faced with serious illness or disability. Similarly, parents who have been shattered by the experience of relationship separation, with the intense emotional and practical challenges flowing from that separation. While potentially overwhelmed by their own grief and other issues, I have seen how so many of these parents have somehow shifted gears. Despite everything, they focus on their children. They express the love and wisdom to say what needs to be said and to do what needs to be done for the sake of their children. When I witness the love of these parents in action, I feel that I walk on holy ground. These people and their actions have pointed me towards the light or the life of God.
There is pain in this story of the baby. That's what I picked out from the reading. Its destiny is to cause a sword to pierce souls, and the thoughts of many will be revealed. First, I have to ask you a question. Is it okay with you that what I have to say will make you uncomfortable? I wouldn't dare say it on radio yet, because it is a message that no one wants to hear. It might be a Jeremiad. Tomorrow, the first baby born in 2018 will be announced in the news, and my reflection is on what it might want to tell us. The baby, I think, is saying to us, this is your finest hour. You are the frequent flyers, the red meat eaters, the carbon burners, but you are sacrificing all of that for me. You are living as if there was no tomorrow, but the sword has pierced your soul. First you stopped Adani, and then you closed down the gas and oil industry, but now you have turned the spotlight round on yourself. Just as all the telephone boxes disappeared in your day, you have made all the petrol bowsers and the new airports disappear in my day. There are now new forests and biodiversity corridors, kelp forests big as the Amazon, drawing carbon down to the depths in every ocean. The reason I know what that baby is saying is because my experience each week is talking to climate experts. Off air, they often say to me that they feel despair, but I'm not broadcasting despair. I don't think there's any place for us to go there. We have to be resolute. And they are, and they're well informed, but people don't want to hear what they have to say. One of them is professor at Manchester and Uppsala University. He never flies. He goes back and forth to Sweden by train, and the radio team gets more comments about the fact that Kevin Anderson never flies than about his former career engineering North Sea oil wells or what he has to say about the future. He says that not flying is emblematic of how we can cut down. It's not a solution, but we in the rich 10% should set this example. But you say, what about my son's wedding in Alaska? Or flying to that climate conference in Europe? What about my bucket list? It's painful to think about, but not as painful as condemning that baby to 6 degrees of warming, which is the path we are now on. Unlivable. Anderson says we have 95% chance of failing to keep the global warming below 2 degrees as we promised at Paris, not because it's technically impossible, but because we do not care. It is urgent that we change gear. When we get on a plane, are we saying, oh, I know my carbon footprint is terrible, but I hope someone can work out a solution, maybe biofuels, or are we saying, I don't care? Australians have a carbon footprint of 25 tonnes of carbon each year, compared to an average European or an average Chinese person who has 8 tonnes. I get Christmas cards saying, Dear Viv, well, we ticked off a few more items on the bucket list this year. Flights here and there, cruises, home renovations using lots of carbon-intensive cement. It's all incompatible with that baby arriving to 2050 in good shape. Anderson's vision for 2018 would be a Marshall-style plan, massive electrification of the grid. The top efficiency standards that we now have for all our appliances would become the minimum standard and would be tightened each year. Norway, for example, would close down its oil industry. Australia would wind down its gas exports. No new airports. It's a harsh message. But as another one of my guests, George Monbiot, said, we as a species are highly altruistic. Our innate tendency is to stand together against threats to our well-being and to treat an attack on one as an attack on us all. And if we could only gaze into the eyes of that little baby and the unborn waiting in the wings, wouldn't we say to the baby, don't worry, it's not the end of the world. We are going to get creative. Another guest was a Bangladeshi climate scientist, Dr. Salim-ul-Haq. He impressed me first by his compassion and his can-do attitude towards the 800,000 Rohingya refugees stumbling into his country from the east as the north of his country was 2/3 underwater. He could see a way of accommodating them. He told me about the advanced preparations his country had to retreat from the coast, to retrain farmers and fishermen for the future. And he said, "We have hardly scratched the surface of the sort of cooperation we need. I don't mean government-to-government cooperation, I mean people-to-people cooperation. Climate change is not a victimless crime, you know," he said to me. And then, after that show, another one of my guests, who had been also talking about Bangladesh floods and architecture and how to adapt, he was from Holland, and he teaches up here at UTS University. He contacted Dr. Al-Haq, and he offered him help for 2018, and he has these plans of floating agriculture and reservoirs and elevated buildings, as they're doing in Holland. So I was delighted by that. It's a green shoot, the collaboration of two people who sort of met each other through radio. All of these speakers tell me that it is more than technological change that we need. Dr. Haq contributed to the Islamic Declaration on Climate Change. Professor Anderson quoted the Pope's encyclical Laudato Si about the change of heart that we need. And we might stop acting as if there's no tomorrow and start behaving as if we really care. Then George Monbiot said it very clearly. I think what he said is what the baby needs to hear. He said we need a restoration narrative, that humans are hardwired to respond to stories. He said that Maynard Keynes had given us a story after the First World War, a restoration story. And so we had the welfare state, we had spending our way out of crisis. And that worked for a long time in the 20th century. But after the financial crisis in 2008, Monbiot says, that narrative ceases to work because we cannot spend our way out anymore. We can't solve the threats we are facing now to the whole biosphere with more growth. We need a new restoration narrative. I asked Monbiot how it would work if rich societies, the frequent flyers, put themselves on carbon rations so that no matter how rich you were, there would be a limit on how much fossil-fueled activity you could afford. And the allowance would be reduced each year until we had all decarbonised. It would be an incentive to innovation, but Monbiot said no. He had moved on from that idea. He said that carbon rations would be piecemeal if people were not ardently behind it. And we know they're not, because people don't want to hear this story yet. Monbiot told me about the 1890s, time of great reform. Before the Labour Party existed, there were clarion clubs, cultural clubs. They took people rambling. They took children from the slums to stay on holidays in the farming lands. They built workers' education associations. And Monbiot said that our society needs that. We need a cultural regeneration in order to give us the strength to do what is needed. He said our society has forgotten that we are the most altruistic species. He said our media constantly tells us about selfishness, corruption and violence, and even here we focus on the bad things that are happening in the world sometimes and then offer hope. But he said we forget what is common experience, the daily acts of kindness, the daily self-sacrifice that we commonly see all around us, and we need to remind ourselves and rebuild our belief in that. He said we need a restoration narrative about system change, not climate change, and not just sort of activists rising up against fossil fuel companies, against deforestation and injustice. He said the restoration narrative needs to be proposing something better and a path towards a safe climate. He described all the green shoots. There's many initiatives going to get more participation in democracy, to build communities, and I think we have a fine example of that at Pitt Street, where we have this sort of solidarity and support on many levels, and it makes us all stronger. We saw it this year, I thought, in Martin Place with that tent city that sprang up, and how that became a kind of negotiating place for those people who were homeless to get some services towards them and to get that huge support from the community. I even saw towards the end the Department of Housing setting up a table there, talking to people in the street. So the restoration narrative might mean for you only flying once every 3 years or never again. It might not matter if you fly all the time, as long as a lot of people don't. It might mean you don't buy new things, really, much, or eat red meat very often, or you don't do those renovations with carbon-intensive cement. It might mean that we turn off the air conditioner and go down by the seaside until it's cooler. It might mean that we stop living like kings as if there is no tomorrow. Because unless we do, everything from now on with those unborn children in mind, 2018 will just see us sleepwalking off a cliff.